Welcome back to season 4 of
A Couple of Multiples.
The Reality of Dissociative Identity Disorder. Did you know that according to a recent Harvard study, 93% of people living with DID are initially misdiagnosed by mental health professionals? That's a staggering statistic, and it's exactly why we're here.
This season, we're diving deep into clinical interventions. What actually helps when it comes to recognizing and treating dissociative disorders? Whether you're a mental health provider, a supporter, or someone navigating life with multiplicity, this season is for you.
Thank you for being here. Please share this episode with a friend, your therapist, psychiatrist, or colleague. Together, we can help improve access to accurate diagnoses and effective, compassionate care.
And most importantly, remember that every system is different. What works for one may not work for another, and that's okay. Your journey is valid, your healing is real, and we're so glad you're hanging out with
A Couple of Multiples.
The Institute for Creative Mindfulness, ICM, soon to be the Creative Mindfulness Network, is the only EMDR therapy training program founded by an openly plural clinician, EMDR therapy author Dr. Jamie Marich.
We felt so validated when we were able to authentically participate in this training as Garden System. And although grounded in the EMDR International Association for Curriculum Standards, ICM elevates the values of lived experience and the expressive arts in their training programs.
They actively work with shattering the stigma around dissociative responses. Please visit www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com to learn more.
Today's episode is brought to you by
Healing Selves Therapeutics, PLLC, a mental health practice located in North Carolina, specializing in the treatment of dissociative disorders and trauma. Healing Selves is committed to serving the plural population through the utilization of EMDR, clinical hypnosis, expressive arts therapy, and other evidence-based practices.
Healing Selves was established in 2019 and currently serves North Carolina and Florida. We are committed to extending accessibility and currently accept most commercial insurances, Medicaid, and Medicare.
Welcome back, dear listeners, to another illuminating episode with Drew
and Garden System,
A Couple of Multiples.
The Reality of Dissociative Identity Disorder. We are honored to have with us once again Dr. Jamie Marich to address the complex topic of addiction, substance abuse, and the 12 steps when you have a dissociative disorder.
Dr. Jamie Marich, she, they, we, is the author of the popular Dissociation Made Simple, a stigma-free guide to embracing your dissociative mind and navigating life, 2023, now available as both a book and clinical flip chart. She is the author of over 10 other books and manuals in the field of trauma, addiction recovery, and the expressive arts. They are an EMDR therapy trainer and founder of the Institute of Creative Mindfulness, one of the largest training organizations in North America that works to create an inclusive space for plural trainees and others with dissociative responses.
In 2019, the EMDR International Association awarded Jamie with their Advocacy Award for her work in destigmatizing dissociative disorders and other mental health concerns. Personally, Jamie Plus is known as the Unicorn System and is a longtime presenter at Healing Together. In October of 2024, her memoir, You Lied to Me About God, came out, focusing on her experiences with spiritual abuse and religious trauma. Continuing her training, Jamie is now a seminary student studying interfaith ministry at the Chaplaincy Institute. They are based in Akron, Ohio, on Erie Nation land.
Welcome, Jamie. Plus, we are so glad to have you on the show again.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Always glad to be here.
Well, let's get started. Can you please give a quick explanation of what the 12 steps are and for what reason some people may decide to follow the 12 steps?
Sure. So the 12 steps originated, the founding date goes back to 1935. And the 12 steps originated with a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. And yet they are not only used by Alcoholics Anonymous. I've lost count of how many spin-off groups there are, like Al-Anon, which is the family programs, Narcotics Anonymous, Codependence Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, etc. If there's some kind of affliction, there's probably a 12-step program for it. And so the founding of AA is traced to 1935, and I'll give you a very short version of a very long story. That there were two down on their luck alcoholics, as they referred to themselves. One was a stockbroker, one was a disgraced physician. And both had been members of what were called the Oxford groups at the time, which were very Christian centered organizations. And they did have 6 steps that they used at the time. And the difference between the Oxford groups and AA were eventually described as the Oxford groups were trying to save everybody who were down on their luck, whereas the focus of AA became on just working with alcoholics specifically. So, as the story goes, Bill Wilson, who was a stockbroker from New York, was sent to Akron, Ohio, not far from where I'm sitting now, on a business trip. And he was given like one last chance by a former employer to try to do something on behalf of this former employer. And he was waiting for what was called the outcome of a proxy battle. It was a big, long meeting. And during the meeting, and Bill was finding that it was very difficult to avoid drinking. He was very tempted. And Bill had 5 months of sobriety, dry time at that point, which he later disclosed would be kind of this obnoxious period in his life where he was trying to save all the alcoholics through some ideas that he had learned in the Oxford groups. But he had learned in keeping those 5 months, he didn't help any other person to get sober, but he kept himself sober during it. So when he was in Akron, he started calling churches. And he said, I just need to talk to another alcoholic. And a lot of pastors hung up on him, but then eventually one pastor connected him with a woman named Henrietta Seiberling, who is a very big dignitary here in the Akron area. And she connected him with Dr. Bob because Dr. Bob Smith's plight was well known as this disgraced physician. So the two of them talked for hours. She arranged a place for them to meet. They talked for hours. And that's when they kind of stumbled on this idea that it has to be one alcoholic helping another. That's the magic solution here, if you will. So the program was really ill-formed during the first 4 years. The book, Alcoholics Anonymous, where the first version of the 12 steps was published, didn't happen until 1939.
Mhm.
And then the program didn't have widespread reach until 1941 when the Saturday Evening Post did an article about, and the Saturday Evening Post article sought out to be an expose on AA as this fraudulent organization. And the author of that article was very impressed by what he saw happening in Alcoholics Anonymous specifically. But the 12 steps are essentially just that, 12 steps, which are seen as the spiritual blueprint for the program. And there are many people today who still follow the steps and see wisdom in the steps without necessarily going to meetings. There are some people who still attend meetings with an almost religious fervor. And something I've really called out in my work, Trauma and the 12 Steps, is just like with any spiritual organization, it can be done well and healthy, or there can be problematic things that happen, especially in certain groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about those things, like it's kind of answered this question, but if you go into a little more detail, like what led you to write the book Trauma and the 12 Steps?
Yeah, so I am personally not anonymous. I, have made no secret about the fact that I got sober initially through Alcoholics Anonymous. And I found the 12 steps themselves very helpful. And I found involvement with AA very helpful because I had the right sponsor. That was critical. And what made her the right sponsor was she understood trauma. she understood addiction very well too, because I believe that if I ended up with just a trauma therapist or trauma worker who didn't understand addiction, I might have been in more trouble too. So I'm glad that I had somebody who understood the interplay. And yeah, I personally took no issue with the 12 steps as they were taught to me. And a lot of the ideas even in the 12 step various books of the various fellowships that were taught to me. But then as I started navigating and attending meetings in my community when I moved back to my hometown, as I uh, saw the way certain treatment centers rigidly use 12 step principles, I started to see that there were a lot of problems. Again, I maintain that the steps themselves don't really bother me, particularly if you modify some of the language patterns in them, because that is where a lot of folks do struggle. And we could talk about that if you're interested. But a lot of the abuses that I see happen in 12 step meetings and in treatment centers that use 12 step ideas would be very similar, as I already referenced, to what you see in any other religious or spiritual organization, where a lot of people misapply the teachings for their own gains, or a lot of people just get rigid and zealous with them.
Yeah, this is definitely resonating with some experiences I've had working with people. So yeah, we had definitely have some questions that we'll get into those in a little more detail.
Yeah. So, what is the difference between 12 steps for alcohol versus substance abuse versus food addictions?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the original 12 steps started with the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And all of the fellowships that have developed, spun off, and have essentially used the 12 steps really just replaced the word. So the first step in Alcoholics Anonymous is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Some programs would say we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. We were powerless over our eating. So again, fill in the word. But interestingly, in Al Anon in the family groups, it's still the same word. We're powerless over alcohol. Some people interpret that to mean the alcoholic, but it's the idea that even family members and those affected can work the same steps themselves.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
So, thinking going back to your story, so what benefits did you personally gain from completing the 12-step program?
Yeah. Well, I personally believe it's never completed. Uh,
Mm.
like I don't actively go to many meetings anymore. I do go to meetings when I know good ones are available to me, and I still stay very attuned with several good friends of mine who are also on a path of recovery. But I personally have been taught that you're always in recovery, and I have found having that mindset to be very helpful. So I've gone through the steps many times, and many of the steps I work on a daily basis. There are prayers connected with the different steps that I find incredibly helpful. I go back to the example of my first sponsor, Janet L., who I talk about in my book, Trauma and the 12 Steps. And she just spoke to me in a way that made so much sense. I believe when I started working with her, talking with her in the summer of 2001, I believed I was just crazy. And I was just crazy. And I had mental illness, which I did. And that ended up being discovered and uncovered a few years into my recovery. Yet, when Janet explained to me that addiction and alcoholism can be viewed as a disease, because the disease model or the disease concept really originated in the 12 steps, uh, that tracked for me. And it's interesting because in modern addiction and trauma work, a lot of people have resisted this idea that addiction's a disease, and it can be framed more as a learning disorder, more as a trauma response, a dissociation response. I think all those things can be true, and you can view it as a disease the way that you can view heart disease or cancer as a disease, that some of it is a matter of nature, some of it's a matter of nurture, sometimes it's a combination of both factors. So I grew up in an ultra religious home where the idea of addiction as a disease was mocked by my father, and it was seen very much as a sin manifestation, and that you had to repent, and that was the only way to recover. And so I remember when Janet L first told me about addiction as a disease, I was like, oh, felt like I was a sacrilegious idea. And then when she explained it to me and how addiction can be framed the way we look at other medical diseases, and that there's treatment and there's things you can do. It just really made a lot of sense. The steps to me made a lot of sense. The idea of higher power made a lot of sense instead of God, and the notion that you can choose a conceptualization of a higher power that works for you. So, for instance, after having so many experiences with religious trauma in my early life and being received into 12 step meetings by somebody as open minded as Janet, I really found a God or a higher power that loves me, that dwells within me. And it helped to, the inclusive language helped to heal a lot of my spiritual abuse. Now, again, that was my experience with a great sponsor and a great meeting. Some people, especially in some parts of the country, can walk into meetings where there is still really abrasive God and specifically Jesus talk that you might find in any other extreme church. And I've really tried to frame it as, I'm glad that works for you all to stay sober, but that's missing the intent of the original steps. And that was even some of the conflict Dr. Bob and Bill had in the early days, that Bill was very much a Jesus believer, having had this really radical spiritual awakening. And Bob really encouraged him, hey, take it easy. Not everybody has this religious zeal that you do. So how can we write the steps with language that is inclusive? And I think it was as inclusive as they were able to go in 1935. And some of the updates that I've suggested in Trauma and the 12 Steps give ideas for how we can make the language even more inclusive.
Wonderful. Yeah. Language is very important.
Yeah, I think sometimes people can definitely get stuck on words, and flexibility is good.
So one of the words, for instance, in the steps, people can, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead of your questions.
Go ahead.
No, do it. Yeah.
But probably the biggest offender is in step 6. We're entirely ready. Well, that's, yes. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. That's step 6. And so the phrase defects of character rubs a lot of people the wrong way, especially trauma survivors who carry a negative cognition like I am defective. And so, interestingly, in the program of Workaholics Anonymous, which is one of the many spinoffs, and I like to say, only half jokingly, I have worked a program of Workaholics Anonymous too, because you get the workaholics really digging in well on our steps. But in Workaholics Anonymous, for instance, they say replace character defects with negative coping skills, because that's all character defects, character flaws really are. One of my colleagues, Michael Gargano, wrote a blog many years ago where he posited you can look at the quote unquote defects of character as parts. And again, he's very clear to say the parts are not defective. The parts are there to meet a need. The parts are there to accomplish something. And maybe those parts get you into trouble, which we know can very much happen. But he suggested that for some people, if the word character defects doesn't work for you in step 6, can you perhaps look at it as, how are my parts acting out? So I think there's different ways to look at defects of character. So that's an example of where I suggest if you need to modify the language or modify the approach of the step to work the spirit of the step, because the 12 steps really, and this is where I think it's an edge for some people, especially in modern times, it does want you to take responsibility for your recovery. The steps encourage you to take responsibility for harm you've done to others or for harm you have potentially done to others. And I think when you do that with proper compassion and guidance of a sponsor, it can actually be very freeing and can keep you from doing harm again. Now, I personally feel that taking responsibility and looking at harm you've done to others, two things can be true at the same time. You can also look at harms that others have done to you as part of trauma recovery. Many of the steps, especially the inventory steps of 4 and 5, are designed to like put responsibility in its proper place, to help you look at what's my part in certain things and what might be other people's part in certain things. Now, some real rigid purists would always be like, what's your part in it? What's your part in it? And that's where it can become abusive. And so working with somebody who understands trauma, either a sponsor who understands trauma, and a sponsor is just an informal word for mentor that is used in the non-professional meetings. And as I write in Trauma in the 12 Steps, a lot of step work really is best done with the professional if you have access to a professional who can help you through the steps that understands a little bit more about trauma.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So this is perfect. What are some other things the program misses when it comes to trauma?
Well, and here's where I could admittedly get a little defensive, because I don't necessarily think the program or the steps itself misses a whole lot. It's what gets done in the wrong hands.
Makes sense.
Kind of like you've heard my teachings on spiritual abuse, religious trauma. I don't take issue with God or even Jesus.
Right.
It's what people do in their name.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to appreciate that the steps were written in the context and the time in which they were written by two old white men in the 1930s. And even C.S. Lewis, the great writer, will say, be careful of chronological snobbery, because for 1935, it was pretty revolutionary stuff. And so, like, a lot of us are updating the language now, and it's good. So I think the steps can be very inclusive. Even the first step, which a lot of people struggle with, which is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. So a lot of people who are raw in their trauma, or a lot of parts, may hear that and say, I'm not powerless. Or, isn't the purpose of trauma recovery to, empower me? I will say this, I take no issue at all, nor have I ever, with that step, because all that step is saying is I'm powerless over alcohol, not I'm powerless. So what it means for me is that if I put alcohol in my body, alcohol will win. I have more than ample evidence of that. And so I think it's actually a very Eastern, very Buddhist idea to engage in surrender. I'm not going to try to fight this anymore. And so that's one of the language modifications that I give people on how you can work step one, if that word powerless is completely triggering for you.
So this is where we need to switch questions, because you need to ask 7 right now, because this is a big deal.
How can a system recognize or admit their powerlessness when they can just switch to another self who does have power to say no?
Not every system can do that. I think some systems can. So then it might be, and this is not necessarily a 12-step idea, but working with the professional on some kind of gathering space work to, let's have a council meeting here on how we're picking this up. No, like I'm a system, and that statement doesn't apply to me. So I think it very much would vary system to system. I do think it's common for one part, or maybe a cluster of the parts, to carry more of the addictive tendencies. Like for us, that's 9. And so the answer very much became, well, how do we work with 9 on what's fueling her to want to drink? And that may be where supplemental trauma work is necessary in order for the steps to be relevant.
Yeah, so like, this is going to fit well with the question I'm asking here. Like when you think about somebody that is a dissociative system, like another question is, like, especially if you have a very large system, right? So like, let's say a polyfragmented system, maybe, and so like you have some people who they have no addictions, and then you have some that do have addictions, and it's like, well, who should be doing the 12 steps? And like, then it gets really complicated when it's, so like the question that really kind of goes with this is, so what is something that 12-step sponsors should know when they are working with someone that has dissociative identity disorder, and what things should sponsors not do with someone that has DID?
Yeah. Well, I have heard it done that some parts can work the steps while other parts don't. I think that's totally fine. And if a sponsor doesn't get that, that's going to be a problem. So I think if you are a DID system and you're wanting to work any 12-step program of recovery, it would be important to expose your sponsor, if they have an open mind and heart, to some of the basics of DID. Or have you ever heard of DID? Have you ever heard of dissociation? A piece of 12-step conference approved literature that I want to recommend. I mean, you could obviously give them Dissociation Made Simple, but if they don't want to read a whole book, this is a pamphlet that is widely available from AA. You can get it online. You can get it at most meetings. AA for alcoholics with mental health issues. And every year at the Healing Together conference, when we do a 12-step meeting, we read one of the stories from this pamphlet, which is about a person with DID who got sober through the 12 steps. So these pamphlets are very big in AA literature to kind of give people on the fly information about things they don't know about. Like there's a pamphlet, AA for working with African Americans, AA for working with Native Americans. And so if we're really looking at cultural humility within 12-step programs, this is important. And the other distinction I want to make, because I don't know if I made it clearly enough early, there are 12-step meetings in the community, and there are treatment centers who draw strongly on 12-step ideas. So Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, the various fellowships themselves have a tradition of remaining non-professional. So meetings that happen in communities are autonomous. They form because a group of alcoholics or addicted people get together. They are self-governed, and they are not professional. So that's important, especially if you work with clients or if you're a client yourself, to understand that meetings are not a replacement for therapy, even though some rigid members of those meetings would like to make you think it is. They're meant to be mutual help, mutual support. And if you are talking with a sponsor, because I think a sponsor or a mentor, if that word feels better, can be very important to give you some support when you can't reach your therapist, when you can't necessarily reach a friend. It can be helpful to have somebody to call who gets it, or somebody to text who gets it. But knowing that their limitations are that they're not professionals, and to recognize, even when you start attending meetings, oh, this person thinks they're a professional, but they're clearly not, and perhaps take what they say with a grain of salt. But I will say within meetings, there are non-professional folks who can do a lot of excellent work with people at the level of sponsorship or mentorship. And those are people who usually are willing to learn. So I very much recommend this resource if you are in a 12, specifically AA, and want to pass this along to someone who's working with you.
That's fabulous
Yeah,
that there's a
thank you.
story about someone with DID in there. I think that
Yeah.
would be super helpful for people, you know. And it's interesting that you talk about the therapy piece and recognizing who's a professional and who's not. Like, I had a client, not a DID client, but he was in 12 steps, and they were telling him, you shouldn't be in therapy because all you're going to do in therapy is talk about yourself, and you don't need to be talking about yourself right now.
That's a very, I'll say this nicely, old school idea.
Okay.
And it's one of those examples of the 12 steps do not say that. The AA Big Book, the basic text, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous calls their basic text. AA people call the Big Book. Bill Wilson himself said in that book, outside help may be needed.
Mm-hmm.
He himself sought psychological help. He himself did psychedelics in the 50s, even after he was sober. So it's kind of like what you hear in churches. Critically ask, is this something the program teaches, or is this something people in meetings are spouting from their own ignorance?
Oh, that's a great question to be asking, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, when is the 12-step program not appropriate for someone with a dissociative disorder?
So I navigate this question very similar to the way I navigate the EMDR question. I think it can always be appropriate if it's properly applied.
Mm-hmm.
And if the person who is guiding you through the 12 steps, your mentor, your sponsor, or your therapist understands how to modify the approach. One thing I will encourage, there are fellowships out there like Dual Recovery Anonymous that can have a little bit more, can it's depending on the area, because again, not all meetings are created equally. But early in my time, I did go to Dual Recovery Anonymous for a couple meetings, because there people felt free to talk about things like their medication adjustments or how they were handling the mental health component of things. And I would say, if in your local area you can't find a good meeting, a resource I want to recommend is intherooms.com. And I will also share an article with you that you can put in your show notes on a piece I wrote earlier this year about, does AA really work? And because I was called into a radio debate about it. And a lot of the critical component was very much misinformation about, these are the things that go on in meetings. It's like, they can, but they don't go on in all meetings. And so I wrote this article to try to give people some points of discernment and some places where you can do online meetings that are quite good. So like intherooms.com, for instance, does have meetings that are more mental health and trauma focused, but still might use 12 steps in them. There's another fellowship based in Canada called She Recovers. Now, they are not 12 step specifically, but they were founded by a lot of 12 step folks. There's some 12 step people who are still involved with it, and they offer meetings for women and non binary folks specifically that do have more of a meditation quality. There's another fellowship called Recovery Dharma, which again is not 12 step, it's an alternative, but still operates on the same idea of mutual help and people coming together. So I would tell anybody, if the 12 steps don't feel like a right fit for you, there may be other programs you can go to for support.
Fantastic. Yeah,
thank you for those.
Yeah, you can. Whatever you can send us, we'll definitely put in the show notes links for all of that. Great.
Yeah. So we've kind of touched on this, but maybe there's something you want to add. How can the 12-step program complement professional trauma treatment?
So I think one of the biggest advantages that it can give us, because I feel very strongly about this, that a client should not only be relying on their therapist, because therapists may not be available, nor do I think therapists should be available 24/7, because therapists have lives too. Yet I can also be sympathetic to how some people may feel, but I need support. I need support. And so if you can connect with people who feel safe enough in 12 steps or any of these other recovery fellowships, it can be a good place to start, with some appropriate discernment to build a support system. As a therapist, I have also felt where a 12-step sponsor can help me do my job better is the sponsor, if they're there to listen to the person's day-to-day complaints or issues or things that they may have to talk about, that frees up the time we have in therapy to actually do some deeper work. And as I said earlier, and I'm sure this can spark some controversy in our community, I do think the 12 steps promote you taking personal responsibility, putting it in its proper place. And if the word responsibility triggers you, it helps you build agency. These are the things I can change. These are the things I can't change. That's the serenity prayer, which is used quite a bit in 12-step world. And I can learn or distinguish ways to know the difference between the two. So that's where I think there's a lot of complementarity. And several times over the years, as a trauma therapist, I've said I wish I've had a 12-step program to send some people to. And there usually is one I could find, like Emotions Anonymous, Depression Anonymous. They're out there too. They may not have the volume of meetings that AA has, because I think another benefit is if you really are working a 12-step program well, you're encouraged to do something productive for your recovery every day. It's not just go to a meeting once a week or just go to therapy once a week. But as an example, my first sponsor, Janet, who I've gushed on now many, many times in this interview, she encouraged me, and I never lost my God contact. So She would have modified this if I was like, I don't believe in God. But Janet did encourage me to ask for God every morning for help to stay sober. And I said, I can't do that. I can't pray in the morning. I'm not a morning person. I'm lucky if I get out of bed, use the bathroom, maybe take a shower, and then get to work for when I have to be at work. And she said, so you use the bathroom every morning? Yes. She goes, okay, I want you to put this book on your toilet seat. And she gave me one of those day at a time meditation readers. And she said, every day for a month, I'd like you to pick it up in the morning when you're on the toilet. And maybe you'll read it, and maybe you'll pray. 22 years later, I still read a meditation book in the morning in my bathroom. I don't have to keep it on my toilet seat anymore. But it created the habit of needing to start my day with some kind of positive ask for help, read something spiritual. So it's those little small things of lifestyle change that you are encouraged to pick up and try in the program in addition to working the steps. Although two of my morning prayers are related to two of the steps. So that can also be how the steps come into one's life. So I think if the steps aren't for you, whatever is going to help you or your system to create some morning routine, that is optimal if you're seeking recovery. I know that 12 step communities tend to promote it as a way of life. And that's where I think it's a lifesaver for many folks, especially concurrent to their trauma therapy.
Fantastic. Hi, dear friends.
We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We'd love to invite you to join Hearts Multiplied, our private online community for people living with a dissociative disorder, along with separate spaces for clinicians and supporters.
Inside Hearts Multiplied, we host live events just for you, including social hangouts, little story time, teen D&D campaigns, online gaming like Minecraft and Mario Kart, and vibrant message boards on topics like intimacy and OEA.
We also offer a supporters group and a clinical consultation group for therapists working with dissociative clients.
And we Garden System facilitate 8-week peer coaching groups where we work on internal communication and personalized healing goals.
To learn more and sign up, visit acoupleofmultiples.com. We'd love to have you.
So kind of getting back to the topic of having, DID and multiplicity, like we've touched on the idea of like who should be doing the 12 steps. Like, should it be everybody or should it be certain ones, and
Depends on the system.
and like, can we talk a little bit more about like how maybe a sponsor should really approach that concept of, are we working with one or two or three out of 20 or 5 out of 100 or whatever? Like how would that really look when you think about like there's supposed to be that 15-minute phone call or whatever? Like, how does that work with the system?
Yeah, I mean, my cheap answer is it depends. Because
Yeah.
it could be that the part that feels most affected, most impacted by the addiction is the one who makes the phone call,
Mm-hmm.
is the one who's doing the step work, but with some input from the other parts.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it'd be very similar to how you might be doing EMDR or another trauma modality. Who's willing? Which parts are willing or feel that they need to work these steps, along with me 9 who really needs to be working them. Now for us it was very much our adult fronting part that worked them, but very much with input from the others, either implicitly or explicitly. So
Mm-hmm.
I just think it very much depends. And for a sponsor who is willing and eager to learn and to adapt, I might ask, what do you feel, what are your people, your insiders feel I most need to know about helping you through these steps or helping you develop this daily routine?
And going back to the idea of like that 15-minute phone call. So like, should a sponsor stick to just 15 minutes or should like different parts each get 15 minutes? That could be too much. Like,
That
where's the
that
line?
I think that could be unfair to a sponsor who's doing this
Yeah.
for free. Sponsorship,
Mm-hmm.
mentorship is not a paid endeavor. And then nowhere is it written it has to be a 15-minute phone call. I mean, that's
Okay.
what is suggested, I think, in some circles. I've never heard that time limit put on it personally. I mean, a lot of sponsors will say, call me every day the first 30 days or first 90 days. And I think it's up to the sponsor to put the limit on the call based on their availability. Now, in my day when I first got sober, we called. Now texting is really the norm. So, like with a lot of members of my recovery network, my friends who are in recovery, we text each other. Like one of my besties in recovery, who I technically still sponsor, but we more kind of have we're friends who aren't hold each other accountable. We just had a text check in. So, I think that can be an option too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
I love that.
Hmm.
So, which of the 12 steps might be most difficult for someone living with a dissociative disorder and or multiplicity?
They can all be a trigger in their own way. Let's just make that clear. I think the ones that are generally the biggest offenders, I'm about to list half of them, are one, we already talked about, that's we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And it's usually the word powerless that's the trigger. Uh, two and three, two is oh gosh. This is so funny. I could say these by memory when I'm asked to, and then when I'm like calling them out on the spot. So two and three are very much came to believe. Two is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Three is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. So for people with significant religious trauma, that can clearly be an issue. Like, you're wanting me to turn my will and my life over to God. No, bad stuff happens when I do that. So those steps may need to be modified. Language may need to be parsed out. A person may need to do some therapeutic work, either in place of those steps or before they try to work those steps. And usually for people, it comes down to finding some power that's going to work that is not you. Because that is a pretty universal 12-step idea that we can't do this ourselves. Now, could a person use one of their other insiders as another power, as a higher power? Potentially, yes. So that might be something that a creative sponsor or therapist can help a person to work on. Steps 4 and 5 are the potential triggers for any survivor of trauma, which are the inventory steps. So 4 is made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5 is admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So this is one, yeah, if you're asked to take an inventory, especially of how a lot of people read it as all the bad things I've done, of course it's going to feel overwhelming. Something Janet worked on with me is inventory means you take stock of the good things too, the character assets, the ways you have survived and thrived. So again, I found 4 and 5 quite empowering to work because I had an empowering person take me through them, not a shaming person. And for in my clinical work, a lot of people I have to do some trauma work with them first, and then it nicely moves in to them taking a 4th and 5th step inventory. 6 is the defects of character step, and I've already talked about how that word can be a trigger, but it may need to be modified a bit. 8 and 9 are the amends making steps. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all is 8. And 9 is made direct amends to such persons whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So you are included in those others. So you may have, let's say, stolen a lot of money from one of your abusers. And so the issue may become, do I owe that abuser back the money? Do I owe them a conversation? And that's where it's case by case. Hopefully you have the most compassionate possible sponsor to talk that out with you, or a therapist to help you ascertain, will making this amend cause me harm? And might the best amend be I just stay out of their life? And a lot of people will talk about making living amends or letting the change life. and not putting others in harm's way. And where this is very difficult, I remember in the first rehab I ever worked in, uh, this person who I will never forget said, "Why am I sitting in this rehab center when my parents need to be here too, especially with all they put me through?" And I took no issue with what they said. I validated it, and that's where it's tricky, because at the end of the day, your abusers may never change. They may never end up in a treatment center. They may never admit their wrongdoing. And so, even outside of the steps, a lot of the very classic 12-step ratings address issues like that. For instance, one is called the acceptance passage in the AA Big Book. And this could be a hard sell for trauma survivors. The idea that acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. Now, I tell everybody, this does not mean you have to fucking like it. I don't know if I could curse. This we just did. Sorry, Nine.
It
this
happens. It's
yeah.
okay.
When Nine gets a little bit of the wheel, um accepting something does not mean you have to like it. You do not mean that you're saying that it's okay. But what acceptance in a 12-step context means is you're not going to fight the reality anymore that something is the way it is. So, like a big mind blown moment I had sitting in a 12-step meeting at 8 months sober, because up to that point, I had lived with the idea that once people in my life understood, then I would be okay. Once my mother understood me, once the boyfriend understood me and finally loved me, once my father apologized, once this happened, once everybody out there got me, then I would be all right. I would be healthy. I would be free. Once they apologized, once I got justice, whatever it may be. And sitting in this meeting, listening to that acceptance passage is when it clicked, they may never change.
Yeah.
I may never get justice. And that's okay. Like, I was able to say that's okay, because what I am in control of today is what I do, what we do, as a collective is how we eventually started working it. And I sometimes think my greatest motivation for being sober and well is I'm going to live a good life despite that all.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that.
And if that's where your mindset is at, I think you will find a good home in some 12-step ideas, because it was very much the 12 steps that gave me that, and specifically my 12-step sponsor. And the two don't have to compete. You can still do trauma work. You can still put responsibility in its proper place. You can heal the things that happen to you. But it also means you're not going to use the things that happen to you as an excuse to continue treating yourself and others poorly.
Right.
Beautiful things there. And the next question, like, I already know the answer, what
Mm-hmm.
you're probably going to say to this
It
question, but I
depends,
think it
right?
would be I think it would still be prudent to really talk a
Yeah,
little bit
please.
about it, though, right? So it's, should any of the 12 steps be avoided for those living with multiplicity and dissociation?
Just adapted. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think any need to be avoided.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, if a person's absolutely like, or their system or their parts are splitting hairs over, I don't want to work that step. I still, as a sponsor or as a therapist, would want to explore it.
Right.
What's the edge with that step? What's the rub with that step? I don't think any of the steps should be forced, because that can certainly happen in some treatment communities that use 12-step ideas that, like, we can't discharge you successfully until you do step 4 and 5. And a lot of places will say that, not realizing how daunting that can be, not just for systems, but for any survivors of trauma. So, yeah, adapted would be the word I would embrace.
I like it.
Right.
Hmm.
So, are there fewer people with multiplicity in 12-step programs, or what makes them afraid to share their diagnosis in a 12-step meeting, especially when being encouraged to be radically honest?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people, it's not just a multiplicity or a plurality issue. It's any mental health issue can still be highly stigmatized in certain 12-step cultures. This other thing that I'm about to say really burns me when people who are on medication assisted recovery, like naltrexone, so many meetings, there's still this, harm reduction is bad, medication resistant, and that completely goes against the ethic of the step, or I'm sorry, one of the traditions, which are some of the guidelines that are also there to govern meetings, which is the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking or whatever the behavior may be. So to me, that demands a radical inclusion in meetings. But a lot of people, quite frankly, get bugs up their butt, and goes back to, it's not the program or the steps themselves that's the problem, it's what people do with them. And people who usually do those things, in my opinion, need to do their own trauma work, because they're acting out a lot of this rigidity as a trauma response. So I have told people, and I use this method in trauma in the 12 steps. If you're going to meetings in your area, or if you're trying out online meetings, don't feel that there's an obligation to share your whole story in the first meeting. You are welcome to sit and listen. You're actually encouraged to sit and listen, and speak only if it feels like that's a burning desire that you may need that day. But you don't have to share your whole story with anybody. So I encourage people to try out at least 6 meetings in your area, or 6 meetings online, and make a log, make a list of where you feel most comfortable, where you feel least comfortable, knowing that you may not feel 100% comfortable anywhere. And it will likely happen at one of those meetings. You will hear somebody, when they speak up, talk about their own mental health struggles. And if you're not hearing that happen at a meeting from other people sharing, that's probably not the meeting for you.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Not the meeting for you. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to try out different ones, note what's comfortable, because yeah, every place is going to be different, and you have to find your place.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so what about precautions that should be taken when somebody has a Ramcoa background, so ritual abuse, mind
Mhm.
control, organized abuse? Like, what harm could occur when participating in a 12-step program?
I personally wouldn't share that until you have vetted the meeting and the people there. But I think that applies for all plurality and mental illness, that you don't owe everybody your story. And something else that Janet taught me, my first sponsor, is that not just if you walk into a meeting, but if you walk into anywhere in public and something in your body mind complex, that spidey sense is saying something's not right here, leave. Honor that. You owe no one an explanation. And so, if, especially because 12-step meetings unfortunately tend to happen in churches or places where there's cheap space to rent for free, because that's where meetings tend to be held, maybe do your homework ahead of time before you go to the meeting. Find out, and the meetings are not affiliated with those churches, to be clear. But if you know there are certain streets, certain parts of town, certain names that can be a trigger or a vulnerability to you, take that into account and discuss it with your therapist. Because I think if you have a Ramcoa background and you're trying out 12-step meetings, uh, it's important to then have a therapist to be able to check in with about, this was my experience, this is what felt good about it, this is what felt off about it, especially to certain parts.
Yeah, I kind of want to go a little deeper on this too, thinking about especially some of the programs that maybe are a little more rigid with following certain protocols or rules or
Mhm.
traditions or things, is the danger of maybe mirroring the mind programming abuse. Like, there's all these rules to follow, and then maybe that has to do with the sponsor, maybe it doesn't have to do with
Mhm.
the program, but they're
Because if it is a good program, there's not rules to follow. There are guidelines, there are traditions, there are suggestions.
okay.
Now, if sponsors are making it sound more like rules, like you have to call me every day or I'm not your sponsor, like I've heard that one before. That's not canon. That's not part of what.
Good to know.
Yeah, a meeting is. So it's like, find another one. either another sponsor or another meeting, because there's a lot of people who take it to a rigid place. Now, once you get into some of the other fellowships, because I could speak most clearly about AA, like there's Overeaters Anonymous, there's Food Addicts Anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is Food Addicts Anonymous is more militant. So that may not be the one for you. Once you get into the sexual recoveries, there's SLA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. There's Sexaholics Anonymous, which in my estimation is more like based in rigid Christian values. So that one I would say has more rules. And I would avoid that one. That's just my personal opinion. But a lot of people in our community do well with SLA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, for that. So a line that is used a lot that really is program is I, as a sponsor, or even today as a person in recovery, I'm sharing my experience, strength, and hope. I'm not sharing rules. I'm not sharing you have tos. I am sharing this is what has worked for me, and what I'm giving you is suggestion only. Now, there are lines like in the opening preamble to the steps. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Some of that language could come across as a little judgy. People who, there's other line in there saying, even those among us with grave emotional and mental disorders have found recovery if we have the capacity to be honest. So I think it's like any scripture, if you will, or any sacred text, if you will. There are going to be people who interpret it in a very rigid, culty way. And there are going to be others who do approach it more from, hey, I'm sharing with you my experience, strength, and hope. What I'm giving you here are guidelines. I do like to follow certain traditions, but proceed with caution if you're encountering a meeting or a sponsor who is not operating in that way.
Okay, fantastic. So kind of what I'm hearing is that people should be looking for meetings and spaces and sponsors that are a little more fluid, a little more flexible,
Mm-hmm.
and not strict.
And that's where doing that, visit multiple meetings or know that you have many more online options in this era to see where you might find that resonance. And I was lucky. I don't know how I got so lucky to find it. It found me because my first sponsor was working in a setting where I was working. And she was the one who inspired me to ask questions and then get sober. So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great. All wonderful things to know and keep in mind.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful.
Very helpful.
Yeah. All right. So, what is one last thought you would like to leave with our listeners today?
Well, I'm glad that this episode is dropping in September, because September is generally regarded as Recovery Month. So to anybody listening to this, I would say Happy Recovery Month. I'd encourage you to check out the article that I shared with Garden System that they'll share here called Does AA Work? Because in that, I give more of my pitch as to how it can work. And that's fundamentally my answer. AA can work, just like any program of recovery can work. But there's different variables that may be involved. And if AA is not for you, know that or the 12 steps, there are more alternative recovery fellowships that are out there now. What I would encourage is that whatever you and your system may seek, is it something that can bring about positive, productive daily lifestyle change. Because even doing that, even if it's something as simple as reading the meditation book from the toilet, can help give you a more supportive structure around your therapy.
Perfect. All right. So how can people follow your work?
Couple ways on socials. Biggest platforms we're on now is Instagram at Dr. Jamie M, on TikTok at Trauma Therapist Rants. And my major websites are myname.com, where you can follow my work. We also have a Substack. If you're on Substack, we irregularly post on there, but when we do, it's usually a good one of our work. And then our company is instituteforcreativemindfulness.com. And finally, our resources page is redefinetherapy.com.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Please, everyone, go check those things out.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jamie, plus for this insightful conversation.
And thank you, dear listeners, for hanging out with
A trio of multiples. The Institute for Creative Mindfulness, ICM, soon to be the Creative Mindfulness Network, is the only EMDR therapy training program founded by an openly plural clinician, EMDR therapy author Dr. Jamie plus Marich.
We felt so validated when we were able to authentically participate in this training as Garden System. And although grounded in the EMDR International Association for Curriculum Standards, ICM elevates the values of lived experience and the expressive arts in their training programs.
They actively work with shattering the stigma around dissociative responses. Please visit www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com to learn more.
Today's episode is brought to you by
Healing Selves Therapeutics, PLLC, a mental health practice located in North Carolina, specializing in the treatment of dissociative disorders and trauma. Healing Selves is committed to serving the plural population through the utilization of EMDR, clinical hypnosis, expressive arts therapy, and other evidence-based practices.
Healing Selves was established in 2019 and currently serves North Carolina and Florida. We are committed to extending accessibility and currently accept most commercial insurances, Medicaid, and Medicare. Thank you, dear friends, for spending time with us today.
We're so grateful for each of you and all the important work you're doing. Whether it's supporting others or navigating your own healing journey, we hope this episode brought insight, encouragement, and something new to consider.
If it did, we'd love for you to share it with a friend, your therapist, psychiatrist, or colleagues. It's one more step toward changing how the world understands DID.
And just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for therapy. Listening does not create a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any guest speakers.
Until next time, take gentle care and thank you for hanging out with
A couple of multiples.